Yo, what's up peeps? Mr. Baier here with an argument essay feedback video. Please excuse the hat today, my hair was a little messy. We're gonna dive right into this, and I wanna first off explain what it is that we're doing here. For many years I've been trying to figure out what is the most effective way to give, many students, in this case between my two AP classes, 45 students, individualized feedback. And that's where this idea comes into play. So what I'm going to do is I'm creating this video, and this video is going to follow along this document that you see here on your screen. This is the argument essay feedback document, which I have also shared with all of you. Now, let me explain how this document corresponds to your rubric, which for many of you, your rubric is where you really got your feedback on your essay. Now, before I even talk about that, I want to take a moment, and I will talk to you about this in class, but I want to take a moment to explain that part of this process of going back through your essay, looking at your rubric, trying to figure out, where is it that, your focus areas are coming up. And your focus areas are really those areas, I hate to call them areas of weakness, because they're not weakness. There are things that you can certainly improve upon. So I call them focus areas. And the question is, can you look at that feedback that you're getting, identify those focus areas, whatever that area may be, and then go back, look at your essay, say, okay, here's where I, maybe fell a little bit short, and then use this video and this document to help give you feedback and fix those areas so that you can revise your essay and resubmit for credit. Now, this video is designed to work for really any argument essay, though you're gonna notice that the argument essay prompt for this is the fear in government prompt, okay? I list that prompt at the end of the document, and I will show you that. So, before we get into the specifics of this document and the feedback on your essays, I wanna show you the argument essay rubric. This is the rubric that you got handed back to you, and like I said, I marked this up unless I left comments in your document, which for some of you I may have done so please check your document for comments. If I didn't, it really was just a matter of time and making sure that I was able to, create this video and give you this more individualized specific feedback. So when you look at this document, you're gonna see that it's broken down by introduction, which in the introduction, it talks about, an effective thesis statement. It's looking, did you address the counter argument in your thesis statement? And did you include a strong hook? Those are the big things that I'm focusing on here. Then you go to evidence and analysis, and you're gonna see this is where it's asking, is your evidence strong? Do you vary your evidence? Do you talk about different things? Different examples that are not similar in nature, because when you have different examples, they improve your argument. This is just asking, do you use examples from your readings, from observations you've made, from experiences, and are those observations, is your evidence insightful? Are you demonstrating that you are, really providing evidence that really proves the point or the thesis in the line of reasoning that you establish in your thesis statement, right? And then the evidence is masterfully developed and tied back to the claim. This is a big one for many of you. This is where, for the most part, people, may have fell a little short, is developing and tying your tying your evidence back to your thesis statement and what you establish in your thesis statement. We'll get to that. And then also, this is where we acknowledge, identify, did you include and address a reasonable counter argument, and did you refute it effectively? We go down, we have coherence and organization. This is where I'm looking at, did you use paragraphs to separate ideas? Did you, in your conclusion here, did you, bring your essay full circle by relating back to your hook that you started your essay with? And then just otherwise, does it follow coherent, logical progression of ideas? You also see we have grammar and conventions, right? This is, you'll see I'm going to point out some different areas that I think people, in general had some difficulty with, but this is just, your typical grammar and convention section. And then finally, this is where, this is that sophistication point, right? Where on the AP exam, or the AP rubric, they have a sophistication point, which is one of the 6 points. This is, asking like, do you incorporate strong voice? Do you use sophisticated language? Here I'm looking for, did you avoid like we, us, our, me, my, I? throughout the majority of your essay. And then the other thing too is, did you employ rhetorical strategies that improve your argument? All right, and then you'll see down at the bottom, I have the elements for the abbreviated elements for the AP argument rubric so that you can see what you would have gotten out of 6. Now, here's how this works. You look at this rubric, and now you're going to have this argument essay feedback document. Within this document, I have broken this down by those different areas or those different criteria on your rubric. So you'll see page 1, we have introduction. Okay, we're going to talk through all this. Then on page 2, we have evidence and analysis. Moving down, on page 4, we get into coherence and organization. All right, and then we move down, we have grammar and conventions on page 6. And if you continue down further, we have language and style on page 8. Okay, and then at the end I've included model essays. But I share this with you so that when you're looking at your rubric and you're saying, okay, for example, maybe you one of your focus areas is evidence and analysis. You can now go to the evidence and analysis section. Let's say you did a great job on the thesis statement, the hook. You don't even need to look at the introduction. Now you can move on and you can look at just the evidence and analysis section. The other thing that I've done with this video is that you'll notice in the description on YouTube, I have time-stamped the different sections of this document so that you can kind of, create your own adventure, all right, when you're going to get your feedback. That is, to me, the best way that I can figure to really individualize feedback for you guys, so that you're not having to sit through me talking about thesis statements again and hooks if you did a great job with that. All right, you can move right on to looking at evidence and analysis or grammar and conventions, all right, things like that. So use those timestamps in the YouTube video, and you can go right to the section that you need to take a look at for your essay. Obviously, outside of this video, if you ever have any questions for me, and I'm going to build in some time in class always for us to meet, discuss, conference, workshop your essay. If you want to do anything outside of class, please let me know. I'm always here to do that, all right, and to work with you. So let's get right into section 1, and I'm gonna zoom this in, make it a little bit bigger. I'm gonna move myself out of the way up to the corner here. And here we go with the introduction. So if you had some trouble with your introduction, take a look at this section. First, what I talked about is hooks. Now, I know a lot of people really like to rely on that question as a hook, and I'm gonna really challenge you to move beyond the questioning strategy, okay? Because I think it's a really simplified strategy. I think it probably worked for you well up to this point, but the goal really is to try to think critically and think deeply and include some type of insightful hook. All right, so we talked about some of these things, but so I'm gonna, remind you of some of these things. But if you can come up with something that's funny, surprising, profound, deep, right, or wacky, some type of observation, that's gonna hook a reader. That's gonna make people want to read what you have to say. Original, simile, or metaphor. Some people use this and did an awesome job, and you're going to see some examples in just a second of those. And then, a quote or paraphrase of a quote. On the exam, you're not going to have the option to look up a quote, and I know some people did for this particular one because we did this outside of class, and you had the chance to do that. But I also know some people actually memorize quotes. All right, so as I say here, include a quote or paraphrase of a quote so long as you haven't memorized, and you got to make sure that you credit who has said it, okay? Now, here's the big thing about incorporating a quote. If you're going to use a quote, seamlessly work it into your narrative, all right? And here's an example of one student's this student included the quote just right at the beginning of the essay: "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, H.P. Lovecraft." Now, the way that we could improve this is, and the fix for this is to say something like, "American author H.P. Lovecraft once said," right, and then go into the quote. All right, that works it in more seamlessly. It seems natural, right, and it flows much better, and then it allows the person to move right on and talk about what does this quote mean and start tying it to, the prompt of this particular essay. Okay. Now, here's the other thing too, and not a lot of people did this, but please check and make sure you weren't one of these people. Do not copy down the quote provided in the prompt. All right, it is acceptable, however, to paraphrase the quote provided as a means of leading into the argument or leading into the thesis statement. So in this particular case, and again, whatever prompt it is that you're looking at, in this particular case, we had a quote from John Adams. Please do not copy that quote down. Again, feel free to paraphrase it to use it for your purposes, but do not copy it down because it's already provided. Here are some examples of some really cool hooks that I've seen, a couple over the years, and some from the current year in which I'm recording this video, right? The very first one, a simile, the government is like a doll. It isn't supposed to scare you, but sometimes it does. That's like funny, but also very insightful, and I'm looking forward to reading that essay. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you'll see the second one, this student really calls on her own life and experience. She says, after being born in Bulgaria, it is difficult to avoid stories about the horrors of communism. Walking in this country, one can look up and see the remnants of a statue of Lenin, or see the dome-shaped building that served as the headquarters for the Communist Party. A fear of communism is valid. However, during the Red Scare, American politics used this fear to gain power, or politicians, use this fear to gain power. That is awesome, right? I am just being thrust right into the middle of this student's history and the student's story, and this particular student has insight into an experience with communism that maybe most Americans don't, and that's exciting. All right, one of the ones that popped up in the current year that I'm recording this video, and I thought this one was great. Fear feels like the empty pit in your stomach twisted in knots right before you drop on the big roller coaster. Again, just a cool way, a simile, which is a cool way of introducing the idea of fear. All right, let's move on to the thesis. Few things just as reminders for thesis statements. Make sure that your thesis is arguable. And this is a big thing. If you got some points off your thesis statement, the question is, did you use the language from the prompt? All right, if you didn't, please revise to do so, because that's going to make sure that you are answering the question or responding to the prompt in the way that it's asking you to respond. All right, here's a pro tip. Outline your evidence in your thesis by using a closed thesis statement if you're having difficulty organizing your essay. Some people did a great job of having an open thesis statement, just claiming in this particular case that, for example, the American government, or those in the American government, use fear to maintain control over citizens, and they left it open just by saying that, and then they outlined their evidence within their essay. However, if you're having a hard time organizing your essay, what I would say is take a couple of minutes, kind of bullet those items out, your criteria, your examples that you're going to use in your essay in the future, and then include them in your thesis statement. All right, the other thing is ensure that your thesis statement clearly states your position. I had a few examples of people where I wasn't really entirely sure what your position was after, I finished reading your introduction paragraph. And then the last thing too is that, I find that the more sophisticated thesis statements acknowledge a potential counter argument in the thesis. And again, that's a really good way of directing your argument, and also, establishing logos, establishing the fact that you are, aware of other arguments and that this argument is complex. So here are some examples of, strong thesis statements. Again, I'm not going to read all of them, but I want you guys to see, where we had examples of both counter-argument thesis statements, and then also, thesis statements that include their criteria, that list out the items that they're going to talk about. So, the very first one I think is pretty simple and straightforward. Although some, like Adams, may argue that Americans would never stand for a democracy run on fear, fear is an integral part of our government. Now, the one, revision I would make to this is I would say integral part of, the American government. Because I think when we say our, it takes a little bit away from the sophistication of it. When you say the American government, you're using that third person, perspective, that third person voice, and I think it makes it a bit more formal. Let's look at the last one. The last, number 4, it says, from historical instances like the Whiskey Rebellion, the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the treatment of rioters and protesters, fear is used to control the people and their actions. Despite the laws in place to prevent the government from having too much power, it still uses fear to control the people. So again, this one has both addresses a counter argument and includes the criteria or the examples that the student is going to talk about in his, her, or their essay. All right, that's it for the introduction. Let's move on to evidence and analysis. So I've broken down evidence and analysis into various subcategories, and the very first one is the relevance of the evidence. All right, and this is really important because I think it's difficult, especially with this particular prompt, to make sure that your evidence is relevant, because you're really being put on the spot to come up with evidence from your own observations, readings, right, outside information, personal experiences, and doing so without any type of text to support you. So this one is challenging because sometimes we come up with examples and they're like somewhat related, but we have a hard time, tying them back to our thesis statement and really making them relevant. So here are some of the suggestions that I give. Ensure that your evidence directly speaks to the line of reasoning you establish in your thesis statement. If it doesn't, either revise your thesis statement, which is always an option, or choose a different piece of evidence. So let me show you what I mean by line of reasoning. So here's an example, and here's a sample thesis statement. This one says, though some may argue that the American government does not utilize fear to control its citizens, further examination reveals that it does in fact wield fear as a tool of power. So my line of reasoning, what I'm arguing, what I'm focusing on in terms of American government and life and fear, I'm talking about how the government uses fear as a tool to maintain power. Okay, that's my line of reasoning. So here would be, if I introduce a piece of evidence and then I'm tying it back to that thesis statement, this would be an ineffective way of doing this. The bad development is Danforth clearly experiences fear of his own. Therefore, it's apparent the government officials experience fear. But that's not what I'm trying to prove in my thesis statement. I'm trying to prove that members of the American government use fear to maintain power, not that they experience fear. Now, I can acknowledge that maybe government officials experience fear and they therefore in turn try to use fear to rule over American citizens. I can certainly do that, but I have to always come back to my line of reasoning, and that's that the American government wields fear as a tool for power. So here would be an example of this, which would be a solid development, right? After I give my example, I say something like, Danforth clearly experiences fear of his own, right? Which I just said you could do. And you'll see now here's where I take it, which in turn motivates him to instill fear in those he governs over. This evidence highlights that the government employs fear as a means of controlling its citizens. Okay, again, I'm going back to that line of reasoning that I established in my thesis statement. So double check in your essay that you've been doing that, or that you did that with every example that you've included in your essay. The second bullet says, are you including the strongest possible evidence to support your claim? Again, this is really difficult, but if you're someone who have like 5 different pieces of evidence, what I would say is narrow that down to 2, 3 at most that you think are the strongest. All right, the goal is not, and I believe I'm gonna address this again, but the goal is not to overwhelm the reader with many pieces of evidence. It's to really develop a smaller number or smaller number of examples so that you can really prove those. Okay. The third bullet says, save your strongest piece of evidence for last. This will be more likely to leave your reader with a sense of the strength of your argument. Most people did this, and so this is just a reminder. The last one says, how do you know if you have enough evidence? Again, this is going back to trying to figure out, and I'm going to talk about in a minute, the balance of specificity and concision. Is trying to figure out, if I have 2 pieces of evidence, have I developed them really well? And if I have, I don't need to go on and include more. If I have 2 pieces and I feel like, well, they're kind of weak, I should really include a third to really try to prove my point, then that's how you make that decision. So here's another subcategory, evidence, balance of specificity and concision. This is, I think, especially the first time we go to write this essay and you're not doing it in class, this is, you're not doing it under timed circumstances. It's really hard to figure out, like, how long should this be? Now this prompt, and for most of the argument prompts, although it's not always going to say this in the prompt. About 500 to 600 or 650 words is really the max that you're looking at, given the 40 minutes that you'll have to take this on the exam. Okay, so now we're just trying to calibrate and get ourselves to figure out what does that look like. We'll do a bunch of practices in class that will help you calibrate and figure that out. So my recommendation for this is provide, as I've said, at least 2 solid examples. All right, the second bullet says your evidence should be as specific as possible to most effectively prove your claim, right? And I'm going to show you an example of this in a second, but you do want to make sure you talk about the specifics of your evidence. You don't want to give a really general example because it's really hard when you give a general example to prove how that example supports what you're saying. So this is where we're trying to find this balance. Avoid overly summarizing your evidence, right? You don't want to talk about and present the evidence for too long, and instead focus on the relevance of your evidence to your overall argument, right? Bring it always back to your argument. All right, rather than bouncing from example to example, really seek to develop your examples, right? And as I said before, avoid overwhelming the reader with various underdeveloped examples. Okay, really seek to, like I said, give enough specifics about your example and constantly tie it back to your thesis statement so that you can really prove that those examples, or demonstrate that those examples prove the point that you're trying to make. A lot of you did a great job with this. The fifth bullet here, make cross-curricular connections. How can something you've learned in U.S. history, for example, support your argument? For this particular prompt, the one about fear in government, a lot of people use like the Whiskey Rebellion, use the Articles of Confederation, used I think Shays Rebellion. Those are all great, and that's a great example of a way that you can use historical examples or something from other subject areas. Now here's the last bullet, and I keep talking about this. So striking a good balance between specificity and concision is key. You want to make sure that your example is specific enough so that you can really demonstrate that it proves your point, but you also want to keep it concise for a couple reasons. One, when you get too much in the weeds of getting in the specifics of your evidence, the reader's going to start to kind of lose interest. Just like when you have to read, and sorry to any U.S. history teachers, but just like when you have to read long passages from your U.S. history textbook, it's hard to stay engaged in that, right? So the other thing too is, right, you're just not going to have the time on the exam to be extremely specific and go on for pages about a particular example. So here's an example that I think everyone should take a look at, and I'm going to read it with you because I do, if this is an area that you were having difficulty with, I do want you to take a moment to read through this. And this example says, currently there is big controversy around the government using policing to quote-unquote monitor protests and gatherings. In the summer of 2020, many protests broke out as a result of inequalities and injustice within American society. A greater majority of the police's response to these gatherings were intimidating and violent towards the protesters. This makes people fearful to exercise their First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, and freedom to peacefully protest, and risk of receiving unwanted repercussions. This can affect all Americans because of widespread news and instant coverage of these events, often painting events in a negative light and frightening those who view it. It also shows how even the most powerful figures in our society can act irrationally out of fear and negatively affect the ones they are supposed to protect. Overall, there is a certain extent to which the government influences the masses by intimidation to establish fear and power over them. So this is a great example of someone really going into the protests for inequalities and social justice in the summer of 2020. They talk a little bit about what was the government's response, but the thing that this student does really well is tie it back to that idea of fear, right? And how is the government using fear, and how is it demonstrating that this fear is used to control American citizens? Awesome job. The third subcategory is development of evidence and your tieback. So if you have tieback written on your rubric, that is because I'm really looking for you to, just as we just read in that previous example, make sure that you are always going back to your thesis statement and demonstrating thoroughly how it is that your evidence supports your line of reasoning in your thesis statement. So here's what I wrote, just if you're having a hard time figuring this out. I said really think 5 sentences maximum for summarizing or introducing your evidence, unless the evidence is overly complicated. Now, sometimes it's going to require you to talk a little bit longer about your evidence and introduce it, right? And again, this is going back to the idea of what I was talking about with, you don't want to get too far into the weeds. So I would try to stop it at 5 sentences when you're introducing your evidence, right? Can you get it to be concise enough that you can talk about it in 5 sentences or less? And then get to your development or explanation of how the evidence supports your claim, right? That's your tieback. Development and tieback are really, I use those interchangeably. You're developing your evidence and tying it back to how it demonstrates your thesis statement. The second bullet says explicitly tie all evidence back to your thesis statement. How does your example truly explore the complexity of your thesis statement? So here are some examples of I think, strong development in tieback. We'll just look at the first one. It says, despite going against national laws, the idea of abortion being legal scares some Texans morally and shakes their ideologies to the core. When this kind of fear reaches the floor of lawmakers at a state level, it takes hold of the citizens of that state. It promotes the idea that a certain practice is wrong and also creates new fears among the groups who depend on the services of abortion clinics. Despite our different stances on the matter as individuals, it's clear that government decisions lead to fear among citizens. All right, so this student does a great job of talking about, currently there's a lot of debate going on about abortion in Texas, and the student does a great job of tying that idea, that example, back to the claim that, these decisions by the American government lead to fear among citizens. Feel free to read the second example if you're having difficulty with this. And then the fourth section and final section under evidence and analysis is the logical counter argument and refutation. Okay, so the counter argument, and some people did I think a decent job. A lot of people did a really good job of identifying a counter argument. The key is then arguing against it or refuting it, right? So the counter argument allows you to recognize the complexity of the question/situation. This is one of the ways that you can accomplish that. The sophistication point on the AP rubric, right? That 1 out of the 6 points is really acknowledging a counter argument that acknowledges that will demonstrate that you understand the complexity of the conversation, and then also making sure that you refute it, right? And as I say here, address the complexity of the argument without arguing for the other side. Your goal is never to argue for the other side. You can concede a bit and say, although there is some validity to that opinion, further evidence or further examination suggests that that opinion is not, or that perspective is not entirely accurate. Okay. And then the last bullet says, be sure that you are acknowledging a legitimate counter argument. Do not oversimplify it. And this leads you to using a straw man fallacy, right? Creating or identifying an argument that people aren't really making. Okay, but for the most part, people did a great job not doing that. Here are some examples of the counter argument, and then really addressing it, refuting it, arguing against it. I'm not going to read those, but if you struggled with this section with your counter argument, please jump into this document, and take a look at those. All right, coherence and organization. So I just left some notes in here about general organization. One of the things that I do want to mention is that I had a lot of people really trying to force, 4 body paragraphs when I think that people should have had 5. If you, under organization, if I circled paragraphing or paragraphs, it's because you had, pretty developed ideas, evidence shoved within the same paragraph. Don't be afraid to split those up into separate paragraphs. Organizationally, that makes a lot of sense. All right, what I think works best is option number 2. If you want to use, let me take that back. What I think works best is whatever one of these options work that you think work best for you. If you have 2 different well-developed examples in one body paragraph, split it up into a total of 5. Split those into 2. Okay. But what I think works best if you want 4 paragraphs is this right here. Have your introduction, give an example with evidence, right? Your example and your evidence in one paragraph, and address the counter argument within that same paragraph, okay? And then move on to your next example, or wait until your second body paragraph, include a second example, and then address the counter argument and use that example to argue against it. Okay, rather than having a single paragraph that gives two pieces of evidence that are very different, shoved into one paragraph and then addressing the counter argument, use one of your pieces of evidence within the counter argument paragraph if you want to use 4 paragraphs. Okay, either one of those works well, but like I said, if on your rubric I circled paragraphs under organization, coherence and organization, please make sure that you take a look at your paragraphing. Here's also just, a general, I'm not going to get too deep into this. For the most part, people did a good job, but if you feel like you were, having difficulty kind of working through your paragraphs and organizing those, here's just another reminder on how to do that. And I already talked about this, but if various examples are well developed, as they should be, break out your examples into different paragraphs. All right, there is no limit to the number of paragraphs. Although, I think 4 or 5 work best for this. Our second subcategory, synthesis of main ideas. All right, and this is in the conclusion. As a means of reminding the reader of your main points introduced throughout the essay, synthesize and summarize those ideas in your concluding paragraph. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second with the examples. And keep your synthesis concise, right? You're not seeking to delve back into analysis, into your argument. You're just reminding the reader of what were your main points that you made throughout the essay. So let's take a look at the first example. It says, in times of crisis or when beliefs are being challenged, presidents and politicians further our fears, whether intentional or not. All right, that's really kind of a restating of this student's thesis statement. Then the student says, this can be seen in President Roosevelt's response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, which led to anti-Japanese sentiments and internment camps within the U.S. After 9/11 and the more recent attack on Kabul airport, a similar distrust was seen towards Middle Easterners, perpetuated by President Bush and President Biden. Again, just really like 2 sentences that are highlighting the main points that were talked about in the essay so that this person can then wrap up that essay. Which brings us to the last part, and that's bringing the essay full circle. All right, so here is something that quite a few people chose not to do. Some people did an awesome job with this. If I wrote bring essay full circle, take a look at this section. At the end of your essay, relate back to your hook. And this might be a problem for you if you didn't really attempt a strong hook. Okay, so what this might mean is that you have to go back and rewrite your hook so that you can then, circle back to it at the very end of your essay. And just as a reminder, bringing your essay full circle reminds the reader of your initial intention in the essay and gives the essay a sense of finality. All right, when you're reminding me of that very first thing you talk about, in your essay, it allows me to make sure that it feels final. And I know where you started and how you're finishing and everything in between. So here's an example. We already looked at this, part of this hook, but I want to show you a hook and then how this particular student related back to that hook or circled back to it, bringing the essay full circle. The hook was, after being born in Bulgaria, it is difficult to avoid stories about the horrors of communism. Walking in this country, one can look up and see the remnants of a statue of Lenin, or see the dome-shaped building that served as the headquarters for the Communist Party. A fear of communism is valid. All right, that was at the very beginning of the essay. Now here's the very end of this essay. When walking in Bulgaria, reminders of the hardships people faced are prevalent. Nonetheless, it is better to use these reminders as a source of strength and remembrance of what was overcome, rather than let it manifest as fear. All right, the student does an awesome job of going back to the hook and making that connection at the very end. All right, grammar and conventions, our favorite. The comma splice. My friends, I have quite a few people who, one of your focus areas is certainly the comma splice. So if you have comma splice written on your rubric, this is your section right here. Just to point out, a comma splice is the incorrect use of a comma between 2 independent clauses or complete sentences. It's when people have 2 complete sentences and just throw a comma in between because I think you're looking for that pause, but really you're supposed to put a period or a semicolon. All right, so here's an example. McCarthy is also using fear to say that if Americans do nothing about it, communism will ruin democracy. This appeals to the fear of losing democracy. Now, this first comma is necessary. Because the sentence has if in it, it becomes a dependent clause, all right, and we need to finish it with communism will ruin democracy. However, this second comma is incorrect. Okay, the second comma is what we call a comma splice. This is a complete sentence right here, and then this is a complete sentence right here. So you have two options. You can use the semicolon. Some people did an awesome job using the semicolon. A semicolon is used to separate two independent clauses that are closely related in idea. In this case, this would be acceptable. So I could throw a semicolon right there. Or if you're not quite comfortable using a semicolon yet, that's okay. Use a period, okay, instead of the comma. When you have two complete sentences, throw a period in between them. Fight, 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 the comma splice. All right, here's a second example that has multiple comma splices in it. In my correction, I use both a semicolon and a period to show how you could use both of those. All right, so again, if you're struggling with this and you need to see another example, take a look in this document. General colons, semicolons, and commas. When you have a list of items, and a lot of people did this where they had a list of items and then they have a clarifying statement within that list, you got to use semicolons to offset the items in the list, and commas for the clarifying statement or a positive is what it's called. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. Here's the example. Unfortunately, comma, correct, there is fear for our health, fear of authority and in the media, which creates biased elections. Fear of others, which makes us exclude people instead of embracing ourselves. Now, this is not a complete sentence. All right, so what we could do to fix this, and because this item in this list, right, fear for our health is the first item, fear of authority and in the media is the second one, fear of others is the third one in this list. So what we would do is we would say, unfortunately, there is a fear for our health. Now we have this comma because we have this clarifying statement right here. Because we have a comma within our list, we actually have to use semicolons to separate the items in our list. So it's going to look like this. Unfortunately, comma, there is a fear for our health, semicolon, fear of authority in the media, which creates biased elections, semicolon, and fear of others, which makes us exclude people instead of embracing our differences. Okay, it's a very specific rule, all right, but I want to make sure that if you're having difficulty with this, that this is something that you can use moving forward. The second bullet says, when you have a complete sentence such as the sentence that begins with however below, place a colon at the end of the sentence when it is followed by a list. In this case, since there aren't any clarifying statements or sublists in the list of items, simply use commas to separate the items. So here's the example of what I'm talking about. This first sentence is correct. Now I included it in there for a reason, and I'll tell you what that reason is in a moment. But it says, many would argue that incidents in American history inspire collaboration and persistence rather than fear. However, further examination leads me to believe that these reactions are a result of fear. Fear of others, fear for others, fear for yourself. So here's how we could fix that. Because we have a complete sentence right here, all right, we can now include a colon right here because we have a list following our complete sentence or our independent clause. So it would look like this. Many would argue that incidents in American history inspire collaboration and persistence rather than fear. However, further examination leads me to believe that these reactions are a result of fear, colon, fear of others, comma, fear for others, comma, and fear for oneself. Now, the reason I included the sentence before this in here is because I want to point out the proper punctuation and use of however. If you had however listed on your rubric, pay attention here, okay? Because this is how you use however when it's separating ideas. All right, now there is a different use of however, and that's when it's being used within a sentence. And I'm not going to talk about that use right now because people seem to understand that one. But please note the proper punctuation of however in this example above. When used to transition as it is used above, there are two options. You'll notice in this case, however is actually used to transition from one idea to the next. In this case, this student did a great job of putting a period, starting a new sentence, capital however, comma. All right, and you'll see that is one of your options to do this correctly. Your other option to do this correctly is to have fear include a semicolon, lowercase however, comma, and then continue. All right, I have some people that have punctuated this really oddly, didn't use any punctuation, offset it with commas, various things, but technically speaking, these are the two options that you can use however. This also works for therefore or moreover, otherwise, all those also, those transition words would also follow this particular, convention. Okay. The next bullet says, as previously stated, under the comma splice section, the semicolon is used to separate two independent clauses. I'm going to change this real quick because it's bothering me. That's incorrect. Get rid of this colon. Is used to separate two independent clauses or complete sentences that are closely related in idea. So I want to show you how this is incorrect, okay, in this example below. It says, Danforth is a powerful authority figure with the town of Salem. He prosecutes several hundred people for witchcraft. Semicolon, hanging 72. Because hanging 72 is not a complete sentence, you don't have a subject and a verb. That's what makes a complete sentence, right? Because we don't have that, you can't just throw a semicolon in there. In this case, it would be a comma, all right, because you're continuing the idea that you were just talking about. Danforth is a powerful authority figure within the town of Salem. He prosecutes several hundred people for witchcraft, comma, hanging 72. Here are just some other additional grammar conventions and style notes. All right, if you, had any issues with capitalization, all right, make sure you capitalize proper nouns. A lot of people forget to capitalize America or American, the revolution, America or American, Revolutionary War, Constitution, Republican, Democrat. English is a word that's always capitalized. Also make sure that you proofread and you have someone else proofread. That is a great, habit to get into, is having, a friend or a parent or a family member, a sibling, take a look at your essay and always proofread for you. But also, you can use, the proofreading that is available within Google Docs as well. Proper spelling, a lot of people use COVID-19. All right, COVID, is a, it's an acronym, so you've got to capitalize the whole thing. Proper way to do that is COVID-19. In this case, coronavirus pandemic, you would only capitalize coronavirus. And the other thing too is, I'm going to have a section where I'm going to talk about, clarity, in different sections that are lacking clarity. I mentioned it right here, sentence clarity. But make sure, and I'll talk about this later, but make sure that, when you're using pronouns, that it's clear who those pronouns are referring to. And again, I will talk about that under the language and style section. The other thing too is avoid overuse of dashes. All right, I have a lot of students that like to use dashes. All right, instead use semicolons when separating two independent clauses, periods when separating two independent clauses, and then commas when qualifying an independent clause, right? Which means, like, if you have something, that a statement that is clarifying something you just said, set it off with commas. Okay, don't use dashes. Dashes, although I think in more informal situations are extremely acceptable, they are not as acceptable in a formal situation. Okay. Next bullet says, when using not only, be sure to pair it with but also within the same sentence. So here's a good example of that. It says, this fear from higher controlling powers is not only seen in education, period. It can be seen in jobs, families, and even the U.S. government. Now, here's what I'll tell you. This is really a stylistic choice. Technically speaking, this is grammatically sound. You have a complete sentence here, or an independent clause, and then you have another one here. But I think what it does is it disrupts your thought and the contrast that you're trying to establish. So here, this would be the fix. This fear from higher controlling powers is not only seen in education, but also, that's supposed to say, but also, don't need it capitalized, but also seen in jobs, families, and even the U.S. government. Okay, so now you're demonstrating that contrast in ideas, or that really the extension of the idea that you've already established. Another quick one, and some people had difficulty with this, if you mention the Crucible, make sure that when you're typing out the titles of longer works, such as a multi-act play like The Crucible, make sure that you italicize it. Also, avoid using slashes and instead use or. Okay, avoid slashes. That is an extremely informal convention, so stick to the formal or. And then also avoid using etc. I don't think I saw this much, but I just want to put that out there because I've had students use this in the past. When you use etc. In an essay, it gives the impression that there is more to say, but that you didn't really want to take the time to think of what that more was. Okay, so I think it hurts your overall argument and your overall piece. All right, we are to language and style, which is our final section, language and style. Now, the sophistication point is by far the most difficult point for people to earn. And there are various ways to earn it. And really, it's a holistic point, meaning that even if you identify the counter argument in your essay, but you have really informal language, it's going to be hard for you to earn the sophistication point. I think for the most part, the AP exam scorers want to see that you're identifying the complexity of the argument through a counter argument, and that you're also using formal, sophisticated language in a high-level vocabulary. Okay, some quick ways though to improve your sophistication is avoid personal pronouns. Limit the use of I, me, and my. Limit the use of you. I have down here, avoid you. Right? So unless you're using firsthand evidence or including a personal anecdote in your introduction, stay away from I, me, my. Avoid I agree or I believe or I think that. Instead, simply make the statement. Just chop off the part where you say I believe or I agree or I think. All right, here's a great example right here. I agree that the United States government uses fear to rule over its citizens. The fix would be cut it right off and just say the United States government uses fear to rule over its citizens. Okay. Now, instead of saying you, now I know sometimes people like to try to create scenarios in the essays. I don't think that outside of a hook that's very effective for evidence. So really try to avoid you because oftentimes when you're saying you, you're really addressing or talking to the reader or talking about the reader. And I don't think that's often your intention. So, or students' intention. So you instead use one or say some or people. And look, I used etc. But there are many other things that you guys can come up with to replace you, which is second person, and instead stick to third person. Also avoid as we can see, right? Instead use things like it is clear that, or evidence suggests that, or further examination demonstrates that. Those are much more sophisticated, much more formal. Also, avoid again, this supports my claim because. However, there was a really sophisticated version of this that I wanted to share with you. This student says, it is often said that America is the greatest country in the world. From a young age, American children are taught of the grandeur of our country's government. There is no doubt I used to believe that too. However, further examination of the American government over the years has led me to believe that in some situations the American government uses fear to control its people. Now, this person uses our. This person uses I. This person says, led me to believe. All right, but they do so in a really sophisticated way. Okay, hopefully you can see the difference between what this student does and just saying like, this supports my claim because, or I agree that. All right, two very different things. The other things too is avoid words like really and very. All right, try to use more vivid adjectives like greatly, immensely, dramatically. All right, those are going to be much more sophisticated, higher level vocabulary, and quite honestly, accomplish what you're trying to say much more effectively. And then the last bullet under this section is use sophisticated transitions such as moreover, however, therefore, ultimately, consequently, evidently. All right, rather than saying in conclusion or another example is. All right, try to use these more sophisticated transitions. And then here's really the advanced sophistication, and this is something, to be honest with you, is very difficult for me to teach because it just requires that you possess a high-level vocabulary and that you can really articulate yourself in concise ways with precise words. So, where can you incorporate some more sophisticated language is always the question to ask. All right, and here's like some clarification on this. Rather than saying some people say that fear is hard to find when in reality it's everywhere, Try to elevate your writing to something like, some challenge that fear is difficult to identify in American government and therefore American life. However, in reality, fear pervades our everyday existence. Okay, that second example is much more sophisticated than the first one, though the first one is strong. Here are some other really great examples of sophisticated language. This first one. What we see evidenced from this book is that power gained from fear is like a unique glass sculpture. It is precious to those who have it and very easily destroyed. Using a simile, right, which is a strong rhetorical strategy, evidenced, precious. Those are some higher level, vivid words. The second one, is it not strange that, for a nation built on the ferocity and fortitude of our predecessors, oftentimes we find ourselves slaves to highly irrational fears. That is not to say that American people are any more cowardly than the average individual, but rather that all are equals under the reign of fear. Extremely high level, ferocity, fortitude, predecessors, cowardly, reign of fear. Really, really strong, powerful language, vivid. There are a couple more examples there, feel free to look at. And I think you'll also find in the examples at the end of this document, the model essays, I have 2.5, really 2 and partial, 2 full essays or maybe 3 full essays, I believe, and a partial essay. You will notice the sophistication of the language in these essays. And then the second to last thing I want to talk about is lacking clarity when it comes to sophistication. I give a couple examples here. The first one says, another time the government implemented fear into its people was during the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. That's not necessarily the correct use of implemented fear into. That doesn't really make sense. You could say another time the government implemented fear as a tool to establish power over its people was during the Whiskey Rebellion. All right, make sure that you're clear in what it is that you're trying to say. This second one got a little difficult because, as you can see here, I made the note, there's an unclear referent. It's not clear who the pronoun he is referring to, though I could figure out after some time that it was referring to Danforth. And this is what confused it. This starts off by saying, John Proctor tries to prove to him that the entire thing is a pretense and that the girls are making it up in order to punish those that they don't like. Even though he sees that it is all fake, he realizes that if he agrees to it being fake, that his reputation will be ruined and he will lose all his power within the government. Again, at this point, John Proctor is the last name that's mentioned, so every time that the student says he, it becomes unclear if he's referring to John Proctor or referring to Danforth. Okay, so just make sure that you are establishing clarity and that you repeat names if you need to in order to make sure that it's clear who you're talking about. The very last one, and some students did this really beautifully, and maybe not even intentionally, but included rhetorical strategies. Seek to purposely, implement rhetorical strategies. I know we've delved into those a little bit. As we go throughout the year, you'll feel more and more comfortable with those, and really should look to start to include those. Some of those realistic strategies that could be used in this task include, but aren't limited to, simile, which a lot of people use, metaphor. I had some great metaphor use, purposeful use of pronouns, short, simple sentences, sparing use of rhetorical questioning. It's important not to over question. Anaphora, which is the repetition of a phrase at the beginning or words at the beginning of successive sentences, and allusion, right? Alluding to, certain events in history or certain, famous events, even currently. Okay. And that's it in terms of all of the feedback. This final section I have entitled Model Essays, for in the event that, for in the future, if we are not working on the Fear in Government essay, I have provided that prompt here for you so that if you're looking at this and you want to, look at these examples are responding to this prompt. And I think it's very helpful to look at these examples. All right, now what I've done is you'll see here's a partial essay, all right, just the introduction and a body paragraph. At the end, I've listed the strengths and the focus areas that I identified based on these. Here's the second model essay, but this is a full essay. This student did a phenomenal job kind of using this slinky metaphor throughout the entire essay, which was really, really powerful and compelling. So if you want to see how someone really uses, rhetorical strategy of metaphor to propel an argument, please check out this essay. And then there's the third one is also one that is really well done. I think you'll notice the sophistication of the language in this particular essay. But you'll also notice that in these essays, there is definitely room for concision. All right. All of these examples are from students writing their very first argument essay. So like many of you, these students, ended up writing probably a bit more than they would write on the exam. All right. But the last one that I included, the fourth one, I think this one's a pretty good example of concision. This strikes a great balance, number 4, between specificity in the evidence and concision. Telling just enough in order to really prove the point and develop the argument without really overdoing it, okay? So please check that one out. I want to thank you guys so much for taking a look at this video. If you watched the entire thing, good for you. That is impressive. I know that some people may end up feeling like doing that. In the end, like I said, I just want to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to really give you as individualized feedback as possible. If you have further questions, please let me know. I am always happy to discuss these with you in person and to support you one-on-one. I hope you guys know that. Thank you so much. Peace and love. Talk to you guys soon.